17 hours into the most significant American naval blockade since the Cold War. 17 hours after the United States officially announced that any vessel entering or departing Iranian ports would be intercepted, diverted, and potentially seized, a ship made a run for it in the darkness. Not just any ship, a sanctioned vessel. Sanctioned by the US Treasury Department itself since March 2023 for its direct links to Iran. Flying a fraudulent flag, nominally registered to Malawi, but the registration is known to be a fraud, Chinese-linked, carrying methanol. And as of this morning, it has exited the Strait of Hormuz, still moving apparently unchallenged. The ship's name is the Rich Starry, and what it did overnight is the most important story about the American naval blockade that nobody is fully explaining to you right now. Because the Rich Starry did not just slip through accidentally, it tested the blockade. It approached the strait when Trump announced the enforcement. It turned back. Then it watched. Then, in the early hours of the morning, it made its move and went through. And as of this broadcast, the United States Navy has not publicly confirmed it intercepted, challenged, or stopped. This vessel, a Treasury-sanctioned Iranian-linked Chinese vessel, just passed through the Strait of Hormuz during the first day of the American blockade. That is not a minor logistical footnote. That is a direct challenge to the central question this blockade must answer. Is it real, or is it theater? Once you understand the full picture of what is happening in that 21-mile stretch of water right now, the shadow fleet, the zombie ships, the double blockade that has paralyzed global shipping, and what a Chinese-linked tanker's successful transit means for the credibility of American enforcement, you cannot unsee it. Let me start with the numbers, because the scale of what has happened to the Strait of Hormuz since February 28th is the essential context for understanding why the Rich Starry story matters so much. Before the war, the Strait of Hormuz handled approximately 130 vessel transits per day, every day. Oil tankers, LNG carriers, container ships, bulk carriers, the constant flow of energy and trade that keeps the global economy running. Since the war began 51 days ago, total transits have numbered approximately 453 in 51 days. That is 9 vessels per day. A 93% collapse in maritime traffic through the most important shipping choke point on Earth. The IEA has confirmed this is the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. The strait carries 20% of the world's seaborne oil. The collapse in transit traffic has cut Gulf oil production by more than 10 million barrels per day. Emergency reserves of 400 million barrels have been deployed. Europe has approximately 6 weeks of jet fuel remaining. And now, on the first day of the American naval blockade, designed to finally force Iran to the negotiating table, a sanctioned vessel passed through and nothing publicly happened to it. Now let me explain the 3-tier system that has been operating inside the Strait of Hormuz during this entire crisis. Because Richard Meade, the editor-in-chief of Lloyd's List Intelligence and one of the most authoritative maritime voices on Earth, just described it publicly and almost nobody is amplifying what he said. Tier 1, Iranian vessels themselves not paying IRGC tolls to move through their own waterway. They simply pass. Tier 2, vessels that secured diplomatic transit agreements through their governments. India confirmed explicitly that Indian-flagged tankers did not pay fees. The Indian government negotiated passage directly with Tehran. Similar arrangements exist with multiple other nations. China, Russia, Pakistan, Malaysia, Thailand, country-by-country deals that gave certain flagged vessels passage rights without direct payment to the IRGC. Tier 3, the vessels that paid directly to the IRGC, a designated terrorist organization under US and EU law. Payments ranging from $150,000 to $200,000, framed as administrative costs, some vessels paying as much as $2 million per transit. And the critical detail, settlement was done in Iran or in crypto, deliberately. No paper trail, no Western bank records. No documentation that any compliance officer or shipping company lawyer would want to see. Trump has said any vessel that paid these tolls could face indictment. The expert was clear. There are nervous ship owners right now. Owners who got their cargo out, got paid for their voyages, and now have a quiet legal exposure that nobody is talking about publicly. This is not just a story about ships. This is a story about who exactly helped Iran monetize control of the world's most important waterway and what happens when the American government starts looking at those records. Now the zombie ships, because this detail from the transcript is the one that reveals the true depth of the Shadow Fleet operation and connects directly to what we covered in our video about Chinese cargo planes and covert supply operations. Zombie ships are vessels that are broadcasting the identification numbers of ships that were scrapped years ago, decommissioned, no longer existing as physical vessels, and yet their AIS transponder codes are still in circulation. being used by active ships to mask their true identity, a vessel that officially does not exist, moving oil that officially is not being traded, to buyers who officially are not purchasing it. This is not a new tactic. The Iranian Shadow Fleet and the Russian Shadow Fleet have been using zombie identification, flag switching, and transponder manipulation for years, refined through the sanctions evasion operations that grew dramatically after the first Trump maximum pressure campaign in 2018. China's commercial satellite companies have participated in intelligence exchanges with the IRGC, according to the Defense Intelligence Agency assessment we covered previously. The infrastructure of evasion, the dark fleet, the zombie codes, the crypto payments, the fraudulent flag registrations, is mature, sophisticated, and has been operational for years. What the American blockade is now testing is whether its enforcement capability is more sophisticated than the evasion capability it is trying to counter. The Rich Starry used a fraudulent Malawi flag. It initially turned back when the blockade was announced, suggesting it was monitoring American naval positioning. Then it made its run in the early hours, when coverage may have been thinner. And it got through. That is not a random outcome. That is a probe. That is the Shadow Fleet testing the blockade's enforcement gaps on day one, gathering operational intelligence about American response times, patrol patterns, and the specific conditions under which a sanctioned vessel can transit without interception. Now the double blockade. Because this is the structural reality that has paralyzed global shipping and created the most operationally complex maritime situation since the Second World War. On one side, the IRGC. Any vessel that wants to transit the Strait of Hormuz must coordinate with IRGC Naval Command. Follow the designated coordinated route, skirting the southern Iranian coast near Larak Island, and in the case of at least some vessels, pay a fee that goes directly to a designated terrorist organization. Failure to comply means the risk of being targeted by IRGC fast attack boats, of navigating waters that may still contain uncharted mines, and of being in a waterway where Iranian gunboats fired on merchant vessels with no radio warning just days ago. On the other side, the United States. Any vessel entering or departing Iranian ports is subject to interception, diversion, and capture. Any vessel that has paid IRGC tolls may face indictment. The blockade will be enforced against vessels of all nations. The CENTCOM statement made that explicit, including Chinese vessels, including Indian vessels, including any flag. What do shippers face on the ground? They face having to negotiate simultaneously with the IRGC, which controls physical passage through the waterway, and avoid interception by the US Navy, which controls the legal consequences of that passage. Those two requirements are mutually exclusive in many cases. To satisfy the IRGC, you must coordinate with them. To satisfy the Americans, you must not have coordinated with them. There is no path through the strait that simultaneously satisfies both gatekeepers for most vessels. The result is paralyzed. And the Rich Starry's successful transit overnight, a sanctioned vessel that apparently navigated this double blockade without being stopped by either side, is the most concrete evidence yet of the gaps in American enforcement that the Shadow Fleet will continue to probe, test, and exploit in the days before Wednesday's ceasefire deadline. Here's what the Rich Starry incident tells us about the strategic picture heading into Wednesday. Iran does not need the blockade to fail completely, it needs it to appear uncertain. If sanctioned vessels can transit, if zombie ships can operate, if the enforcement gap between the announcement of the blockade and its actual operational execution creates enough ambiguity, then Iran can argue to its domestic audience and to international observers that the American blockade is not as absolute as Washington claims. That argument is worth enormously more to Iran's negotiating position than any military victory. What Iran says it wants from these negotiations: sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, the right to charge transit fees, sanctions relief, frozen asset releases. What Iran actually wants to survive this crisis with enough institutional legitimacy intact that the next American administration, or even this one, cannot simply restart maximum pressure without significant political cost. The Rich Starry, navigating through the blockade on day one, is a piece of that argument. Not a decisive military victory, a data point, a signal to the shipping industry that the strait is not completely closed, a signal to China that its vessels can still move, a signal to Tehran's domestic audience that the IRGC has not been fully defeated, and a direct challenge to Washington to either enforce the blockade absolutely, seizing every sanctioned vessel regardless of flag or consequences, or acknowledge that the blockade has enforcement limits that sophisticated shadow fleet operators can exploit. Here's what to watch in the next 48 hours, specifically from a maritime perspective. Watch whether the US Navy publicly responds to the Rich Starry transit. If they say nothing, the Shadow Fleet has learned that sanctioned vessels can move in the early hours of enforcement. If they announce an interception or investigation, the blockade's credibility is partially restored, but the incident has already provided intelligence value to Iran and China about American patrol patterns. Watch the Shadow Fleet probes. The Rich Starry was the first test. There are reportedly additional vessels, including other sanctioned tankers, heading toward the strait. Each one is a probe. The pattern of which ones get stopped and which ones do not will define the effective enforcement perimeter of the blockade more accurately than any official statement. Watch the indictment question. Trump has warned ship owners who paid IRGC tolls could face legal consequences. If the Department of Justice begins issuing subpoenas to shipping companies even quietly, it changes the calculus for every shipping company that got cargo out of the Gulf during the crisis. That legal pressure is potentially more powerful than any naval interception. Watch the Chinese government's response. The Rich Starry is Chinese-linked. If Beijing says nothing, it is tacitly endorsing the transit. If Beijing makes any statement about the ship, it signals how aggressively China is prepared to push back against American enforcement of a blockade that directly affects China's energy supply. 20% of China's oil comes through the Strait of Hormuz. Wednesday is 2 days away. The blockade is 17 hours old. The first sanctioned vessel has already passed through, and the Shadow Fleet is watching to see what happens next. Watch the facts, not the statements.